The tip of a spear touched the base of my throat before I had taken 3 steps into the hall. "Kneel," the guard said, his voice sharp as broken glass. I did not move. Around me, the entire court of Threnvok had gone silent, and I could feel 100 alien eyes locked onto me like targeting scopes. I was human, unarmed except for the sidearm I was not allowed to draw, and standing in the middle of one of the most dangerous throne rooms in this part of the galaxy. And somehow, out of every sensible thing I could have done, I chose this exact moment to ask a question instead of obeying an order. "Why?" I said. The guard blinked, his slitted eyes narrowing like he had never once been asked that in his entire life. Behind him, on a raised platform made of black stone and threaded with veins of glowing blue mineral, sat the woman every soldier, diplomat, and king in the sector had warned me about. Princess Ixara Velthane, the unbroken flame, the one who had turned away 13 kings and buried at least one of them for trying to force the issue. I had come to Threnvok as part of a trade escort. My job was simple. Stand near Grace Whitfield, the human envoy, look intimidating, and make sure nobody tried anything clever during the signing of a resource agreement. Nobody told me I would end up standing in front of a princess with a spear at my throat because I forgot to bow. Grace was 3 steps behind me, and I could hear her breathing get tight. "Do not do this, Ethan," she whispered. "Just kneel. It costs you nothing." Maybe it costs me nothing to her. To me, it felt like it cost everything. Where I come from, you kneel for people who have earned it, not people who were simply born into a chair. I did not say that out loud, obviously. I am reckless, not suicidal. The princess raised one hand, and the guard's spear pulled back an inch, though it did not lower completely. She studied me the way a hunter studies something that has wandered into her territory without realizing what territory it is. "You refuse to kneel," she said. Her voice was calm, almost bored, like this happened every single day. "Do you understand what world you are standing on?" "I understand I am standing on a very nice floor," I said. "It is a shame nobody explained the house rules before I walked in." A ripple went through the court. Some of it sounded like a gasp. Some of it sounded unmistakably like someone trying not to laugh and failing badly. I did not dare look around to see who. The princess tilted her head. She had pale, storm-colored skin, sharp cheekbones, and eyes the color of hot amber that seemed to catch every bit of light in the room and throw it back twice as bright. She did not look amused. She looked curious, and from everything I had heard about her, curiosity from this woman was far more dangerous than anger. 13 kings have knelt in this hall," she said. 13 kings have brought me gifts beyond counting. 13 kings have left this world in shame, or worse. And you, a mercenary from a planet most of my court could not find on a star chart, refuse even the smallest courtesy. "I am not a king," I said. "I am hired muscle, standing behind a woman doing paperwork. Different set of rules." Grace made a small, strangled sound behind me that I chose to interpret as agreement. The princess rose from her throne. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath at once, and I understood, in that moment, exactly how much power this woman carried without needing to raise her voice. She walked down the steps slowly, her long dark cloak trailing behind her like something alive, and stopped close enough that the guard finally lowered his spear out of pure confusion about what was supposed to happen next. "Do you know what they call me on other worlds?" she asked. "I have heard a few things," I admitted. "Most of them involve the word feared, a couple involve the word cursed. One very drunk trader on the transport ship called you something I will not repeat in polite company." For the first time, something flickered across her face that was not calculation. It might have been surprise. It might have even been the beginning of a smile, though she buried it fast. "And are you afraid of me, human?" she asked. I thought about lying. It would have been the smart move. Instead, I told her the truth, because apparently that was becoming a pattern for me in the last 2 minutes. "Not yet," I said. "Ask me again after dinner." The silence that followed was the loudest silence I had ever experienced. I fully expected the guard's spear to find my throat again, this time without hesitation. Instead, the princess laughed. It was short, sharp, and clearly rusty from lack of use, like a door that had not been opened in years finally swinging free. "Bring him to the banquet," she said, turning back toward her throne. "Do not bring the others. I am tired of watching kings compete over who can flatter me the loudest." Grace grabbed my arm the moment the princess was out of earshot, her nails digging in hard enough to leave marks. "Are you insane?" she hissed. "Do you understand what you just did? 13 kings, Ethan. 13. One of them tried to bribe half her council and ended up recalled to his homeworld in a box. Another one insulted her cooking and was quietly never heard from again. You just made jokes at her." "I am aware," I said, though my heart was hammering hard enough that I was fairly sure everyone in a 3-meter radius could hear it. In my defense, nobody handed me a manual. That evening, I was escorted through corridors carved from stone, so dark it seemed to swallow the torchlight around it, into a banquet hall smaller and quieter than I expected. No crowd of nobles, no rows of watching guards. Just a long table, a handful of candles, and the princess seated at the head of it, watching me the way someone studies a puzzle they have not yet decided is worth solving. "Sit," she said. "Try the wine. Tell me what you think." I sat. I picked up the glass. I drank. And then, because apparently I had not learned anything from the throne room, I set the glass down and made a face I did not bother to hide. "This tastes like burnt copper," I said. The table attendant standing near the wall visibly flinched, like I had just insulted a sacred ancestor. The princess, however, went very still, and then leaned forward with an expression I had not seen on her yet. Genuine, undivided interest. "Every guest who has ever sat at this table has told me the wine is exquisite," she said. "Kings, diplomats, generals from 3-star systems, all of them told me it was the finest vintage in the sector. Then either they have terrible taste, or they were too scared to tell you the truth," I said. "I am guessing the second one." She studied the glass for a long moment, turned it slowly in her fingers, and then, to my genuine shock, set it aside without finishing it either. "You may be the first honest man to sit at this table in over a decade," she said quietly. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which was probably the smartest decision I had made all day. Outside the tall windows behind her, I could see the twin moons of Threnn Vok rising over a jagged black horizon, and somewhere far below us, in the lower levels of the palace, I could hear the faint murmur of a court that was already, I was certain, talking about nothing else but the human who had refused to kneel and then insulted the royal wine in the same day. I did not know it yet, but I had just made 13 very powerful enemies without lifting a single finger against any of them, and I had made one friend whose attention, I would soon learn, was far more dangerous to keep than to lose. She studied me a moment longer, then finally spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost private, like she was sharing something she did not offer easily. "Tell me something true, human," she said. "Not something clever, not something to make me laugh. Something true." I thought about it. I thought about the mission briefing that told me to stay silent, and stay armed, and never speak unless spoken to. I thought about Grace, somewhere in the guest wing, probably pacing a hole in the floor worrying about what I might say next. And then I looked at this woman who 13 kings had failed to move even an inch, and I gave her the only true thing I had. "I do not know why everyone is so afraid of you," I said, "but I think you have been waiting a very long time for someone to ask that question instead of just believing the answer." For a long moment, she said nothing at all. Then, quietly, almost too quiet to hear, she said one word. "Finally." I did not understand yet what that word would cost me. I only knew, sitting at that long, dark table under 2 rising moons, that something had just shifted, and there was no going back to being simply hired muscle, standing behind a woman doing paperwork. Whatever came next, I had already stepped into it the moment I refused to kneel. The next morning, I learned that surviving dinner with Princess Ixara Velthane was apparently only the first test, and not even the hardest one. Owen Blake, the other human soldier assigned to our escort detail, found me in the guest wing while I was still trying to figure out which of 6 identical doors led back to my room. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and an expression that told me he had already heard everything. "You insulted the royal wine," he said, to her face. "At a private dinner. Do you have some kind of death wish nobody told me about?" "I have a taste for honesty," I said. "Apparently it is contagious." Owen shook his head slowly, the way he always did right before telling me I had made a mistake I would regret. "Word is already spreading through the palace staff," he said. "Some of them think you are either the bravest man alive or the biggest fool they have ever seen serving wine to. Nobody seems sure which. Can it not be both?" I asked. Before he could answer, a palace attendant appeared at the end of the corridor, dressed in the deep blue robes of the royal household, and bowed low enough that her forehead nearly touched the floor. "The princess requests your presence," she said, looking directly at me. "Alone." Owen raised an eyebrow so high it nearly vanished into his hairline. "Alone," he repeated. "That does not sound like a good sign." It sounded worse once I actually arrived. Instead of the throne room or the banquet hall, the attendant led me down a spiraling staircase into a part of the palace I had not seen before, cooler and quieter, with walls that seemed older than everything above them. At the bottom waited a wide circular chamber with a sunken floor, its stone marked with faint scorch patterns that told me this was not a room built for pleasant conversation. Princess Ixara stood at the center of it, dressed differently than she had been the night before. Gone was the heavy formal cloak. In its place was a fitted training garment, dark and practical, and in her hand she held a long curved blade that caught the torchlight in a way that made my stomach tighten. "You asked me a question last night," she said. "I have decided to answer it properly. I did not ask you to a fight," I said carefully. "You did not have to," she said. "Every king who has come to this world has claimed courage before ever proving it. Words are easy. I have grown tired of words." A second blade was tossed toward me from somewhere near the wall, landing with a metallic clatter at my feet. I picked it up slowly, testing the weight, and reminded myself that this woman had, according to at least 3 separate rumors, ended the life of one suitor who had displeased her. I had no intention of becoming rumor number 4. "This is not a fight to harm," she said, as if reading the tension in my shoulders. "This is a test of nerve. My blade will come close. It will not touch you unless you are careless enough to let it. What I want to know is whether you flinch away from danger, or whether you stand your ground and think clearly through it." "That is a strange way to interview a guest," I said. "I am not interviewing a guest," she said. "I am learning who you actually are, beneath the jokes." What followed was, without question, one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. She moved with a speed and precision that made it clear she had trained for this since childhood, her blade slicing through the air in tight, controlled arcs that stopped a hair's width from my skin again and again. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to back away, to duck fully out of range, to protect myself the way any reasonable person would. I forced myself instead to breathe, to track the angle of her wrist, to read the rhythm underneath the danger, the same way I had been trained to read incoming fire on a real battlefield. I did not attack her. I did not need to. I simply stood my ground, moved only enough to stay whole, and matched her pace without ever giving her the satisfaction of watching me run. When she finally stepped back, breathing harder than she had been at the start, there was sweat on her brow and something unreadable in her expression. "You did not flinch," she said. "I flinched plenty on the inside," I admitted. "I am just better at hiding it than most people." "That," she said, "is the entire point." I set the blade down carefully, my hands not entirely steady, and allowed myself a long breath now that the immediate danger had passed. That was not the last test, though. Over the following days there were others, each stranger than the last. A night alone in a chamber crawling with venomous moon serpents native to Threnn Vok, where I learned that staying perfectly still and breathing slow was far more effective than panicking. A negotiation trap disguised as a simple courtesy meeting, where a visiting merchant tried to trick me into signing away trade rights on behalf of the human envoy, and I caught the deception only because Grace had drilled contract language into me for weeks before the mission. A poisoned cup slipped into a crowded reception, which I noticed only because the surface shimmered wrong under the light. A detail I would never have caught if a grizzled quartermaster back home had not once taught me to always check my drink twice. Each time I passed, word spread a little further through the palace. Each time, I noticed Princess Ixara watching from somewhere in the room, never openly, always at a careful distance, as though she needed to see for herself rather than trust the reports of others. It was during the 5th test, a formal court dinner meant to honor visiting dignitaries, that I first met King Dravenkor. He arrived with an entourage of a dozen armored attendants, his robes stitched with gold thread that probably cost more than my entire contract fee, and a smile that did not reach his eyes even once during the entire evening. He was tall, even for his species, with pale gray skin and eyes so dark they looked almost black, and he carried himself like a man who had never once in his life been told no and fully intended to keep it that way. "So," he said, settling into the seat directly across from me without waiting for an invitation, "you are the human everyone is talking about." "I am one of several humans on this world," I said. "You will have to be more specific." His smile thinned slightly. "The one who refused to kneel," he said. "The one who insulted her wine. The one she has spent the last week testing like a prized animal at market. That human." I did not correct him, mostly because there did not seem to be much point. "Do you understand what you are interfering with?" he continued, his voice dropping low enough that only I could hear it clearly over the noise of the hall. "This is not a game, soldier. There are alliances at stake here. Trade routes, military pacts spanning half the sector. Her hand is not simply a romantic prize, it is a political one, and every single one of those 13 kings you have heard so much about had a legitimate claim to pursue it." "Then it should not bother you if I do not," I said. "I am not pursuing anything. I am hired to guard an envoy." His eyes flicked briefly toward the head of the table, where Ixara sat in quiet conversation with an advisor, and then back to me, sharp and cold. "She does not test hired guards," he said. "She tests suitors. Whether you understand that title yet or not, you have already claimed it in the eyes of this entire court, and I would strongly suggest you consider what happens to men who claim titles they cannot defend." "Is that a threat?" I asked, keeping my voice level even as every muscle in my back tightened. "It is a courtesy," he said, rising from his seat, with the same false smile still fixed in place. "I would hate for something unfortunate to happen to a guest of the palace. Accidents do occur, even in the safest of places." He left without another word, his entourage falling into step behind him like a wave following the moon. Across the table, Grace leaned close, her voice tight with worry. "That was King Dravenkor," she whispered. "He controls 3 trade routes our envoy desperately needs access to. If he decides you are a problem worth removing, Ethan, our entire mission could collapse along with you." "I understand," I said, though understanding did very little to slow the uneasy churn in my stomach. That night, walking back to my quarters through a mostly empty corridor lit only by scattered torchlight, I heard the faintest scrape of a boot against stone somewhere behind me. I had spent enough years in dangerous places to trust that instinct without question. I dropped low and turned in one motion, just as a blade meant for the space where my head had been an instant earlier sliced through empty air instead. The attacker wore no obvious colors, no visible crest, nothing that would identify who had sent him. That alone told me everything I needed to know. This had been planned carefully, by someone who understood exactly how to hide their involvement. I did not have time to think about who. I only had time to fight. He came at me fast, clearly trained, clearly not amateur muscle hired off the street. I caught his second strike on my forearm, feeling the impact rattle up into my shoulder, and drove my elbow hard into his ribs, forcing enough distance to draw the small blade I kept hidden along my boot. A habit from years of missions that had taught me never to walk anywhere completely unarmed, palace protocol or not. We traded blows in the dim corridor, neither of us speaking, both of us fully aware that the only outcome that mattered was who remained standing when it ended. I finally managed to knock the blade from his hand and pin him hard against the stone wall, my forearm pressed against his throat just enough to hold him still without doing lasting harm. "Who sent you?" I demanded. He said nothing. His eyes, however, flicked briefly toward a ring on his own hand, a small crest I did not recognize, before he wrenched free with a strength I had not expected and bolted down the corridor into the darkness before I could stop him. I stood there a long moment, breathing hard, my pulse hammering in my ears, and understood with sudden clarity that whatever had started the moment I refused to kneel in that throne room had just become something far more dangerous than court gossip and dinner tests. Word reached the princess before I even made it back to my quarters. By the time I arrived, she was already waiting outside my door, flanked by 2 guards, her expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight. "I heard what happened," she said. "Are you injured?" "Nothing serious," I said, though my forearm throbbed where the first blow had landed. She studied me for a long moment, and something in her face shifted, softened slightly, though the sharp edge of concern beneath it never fully disappeared. "This is what I have been trying to protect people from," she said quietly. "Every suitor who comes near me becomes a target for someone else's ambition. I did not intend for you to be pulled into that danger. I am already in it," I said. "Might as well see it through properly." She held my gaze a long moment, and for the first time since I had arrived on Thren Vok, I saw something in her expression that looked less like calculation and more like fear, not for herself, but for me. "Then we had better find out who wants you dead," she said, "before they succeed where they failed tonight." Neither of us knew yet just how deep that answer would go, or how many more nights like this one still waited ahead before the truth finally came into the light. The ring I had seen on the attacker's hand turned out to be the first real clue in an investigation that would consume the following 3 days, and nearly cost me everything before it was finished. Owen and I spent the morning after the attack going through the palace armory records with a guard captain named Selen, a stern, no-nonsense Thren officer who had apparently taken a quiet liking to the fact that I had survived 5 separate tests designed to break lesser men. She pulled up an old ledger of noble house crests, running her finger down page after page of symbols until she stopped abruptly on one near the bottom of the 3rd column. "That crest," she said, tapping the page. "It belongs to a minor trading house allied with King Dravenkor's territory. Not his personal guard, but close enough to answer to him when the price is right." "I am shocked," I said flatly, truly stunned. Owen crossed his arms, studying the page over Selen's shoulder. "Even if it traces back to him, we cannot prove intent," he said. "A smart man like that would never leave a direct line between himself and an assassin. He will simply claim the attacker acted alone, or worse, claim someone is trying to frame him to weaken his standing at court." He was right, and I hated that he was right. Politics, I was quickly learning, moved far slower and far more carefully than any battlefield I had ever fought on. On a battlefield, you could see the enemy coming. Here, the enemy smiled at you across a dinner table while quietly arranging your death behind a curtain of plausible denial. Princess Ixara called a private council that afternoon, gathering her closest advisors along with Grace, Owen, and myself in a chamber lined with old star charts and faded battle banners from conflicts I did not recognize. At the head of the table sat a thin, sharp-faced Thren man, introduced to me as Chancellor Mordain, her chief advisor since childhood, whose calm, measured voice carried an authority that seemed to settle the room the moment he spoke. "An attack on a guest within these walls is an attack on the crown itself," Mordain said, his fingers steepled in front of him. "If King Dravenkor is truly responsible, this cannot go unanswered. However, Princess, I would urge caution. Accusing a king of this magnitude without absolute proof risks fracturing an alliance 3 generations in the making." Ixara's jaw tightened, though her voice remained level. I am well aware of what is at stake, Chancellor. I am equally aware that I nearly lost a guest of this court to a blade meant for his throat. I will not simply look away from that to preserve convenient politics. I appreciate the sentiment, I said carefully, aware I was speaking somewhat out of turn in a room clearly built for people far more important than me. But if we move against him without proof, we hand him exactly the excuse he needs to claim victimhood. That is worse than doing nothing. Mordane's eyes flicked toward me with something that looked, just briefly, like approval. The human speaks sense, he said. Increase security around him quietly. Watch Dravencor's movements without alerting him to it. Let him believe his first attempt failed through simple bad luck, not through discovery. It was, I had to admit, a solid plan. It also meant the next several days passed with a constant, low-grade tension humming beneath every interaction, every meal, every quiet walk through the palace gardens. I began noticing details I had never bothered to notice before, which exits led where, which guards changed shifts at which hour, which servants lingered a little too long near doorways they had no reason to be standing at. Ixara and I spent more time together during those days than either of us likely intended, though I suspect neither of us minded it as much as we pretended to. She showed me the palace archives, an enormous chamber of ancient records stretching back centuries, and told me stories about her homeworld that made it clear the crown she carried was far heavier than the confident mask she wore in public. My mother ruled before me, she said one evening, standing at a tall window overlooking the palace gardens as the twin moons rose in the distance. She was strong, respected, and utterly alone by the end of her reign. Every ally she trusted eventually wanted something from her that had nothing to do with genuine loyalty. I watched that happen to her for years before the crown ever passed to me. Is that why you test everyone so relentlessly? I asked. It is why I have to, she said quietly. If I cannot trust the people closest to me, I cannot afford to trust anyone at all. It is a lonely way to live, but it is safer than the alternative. I did not have a clever answer for that, so I simply stood beside her in silence, watching the moons climb higher over the dark horizon, and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the woman 13 kings had feared was not cold by nature. She had simply been forced to become that way by people who kept proving her right to be careful. The peace did not last. On the fourth night, everything shattered at once. I was awakened well past midnight by Owen pounding on my door, his voice tight with urgency I had rarely heard from him. "Ethan, get up," he said. "Something is happening in the East Wing. Guards are moving fast, and nobody is telling us anything." I dressed in seconds, grabbing my blade and sidearm before following him down the corridor at a dead run. We arrived at the East Wing to find chaos already unfolding, guards shouting orders, smoke curling faintly from a shattered window, and Selen barking commands at a squad forming up near the grand staircase. "What happened?" I demanded. "An explosion in the lower archive vault," Selen said, her face grim. "Someone triggered it remotely. We believe it was meant as a distraction." "A distraction for what?" Owen asked. The answer came from further down the corridor, in the form of Chancellor Mordane running toward us faster than a man his age should have been able to move, his robes disheveled and his expression stripped of its usual composure. "The princess's private chambers," he said, breathless. "She is not there. Her personal guard was found unconscious near the servants' passage. She is gone." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. I did not think. I simply moved, sprinting down the corridor toward the servants' passage Mordane had described, Owen close behind me, Selen shouting orders to mobilize the rest of the guard as we ran. The passage was narrow, lit only by scattered emergency lighting, and led down a series of stairs into a lower service level rarely used by anyone above kitchen staff. At the bottom, we found the unconscious guard exactly where Mordane said he would be, along with a discarded cloak I recognized instantly from the tests Ixara had put me through days earlier, the same dark, practical fabric she wore when she wanted to move without drawing attention. "She fought back," I said, kneeling to examine the guard's pulse and confirming he was alive, simply stunned. This was not a clean abduction. Whoever took her, she made them work for it. That does not surprise me in the slightest, Owen muttered, though the tension in his voice betrayed how worried he actually was. We followed the trail through a service tunnel that eventually opened into an old loading dock at the base of the palace, used for supply transports rather than official visitors. There, illuminated by harsh floodlights, stood a small transport ship bearing markings I recognized instantly from the crest Selin had shown us days earlier. Dravencor's colors, I said. Bold of him, Owen said grimly, drawing his weapon, attacking within the palace itself, and moving her before dawn even breaks. He must be desperate, or confident, I said, my eyes scanning the loading dock for cover, for angles, for anything that might give us an advantage against what was clearly a heavily guarded position. Confident men make mistakes just as often as desperate ones. There was no time for a careful plan. The transport engines were already beginning to hum with power, and I understood with total clarity that if that ship left the ground with Ixara aboard, finding her again anywhere in the sector would become infinitely harder, if it remained possible at all. I am going in, I said. Ethan, that is a dozen armed guards against 2 of us, Owen said. We need to wait for Selin's squad. There is no time, I said. Every second we wait is a second closer to that ship leaving orbit with her on it. Owen swore under his breath, but he did not argue further. Instead, he simply checked his weapon, gave me a short nod, and said the only thing that mattered in that moment. Then let us go get her back. We moved fast and low across the loading dock, using stacked supply crates for cover, taking down the first 2 guards before they even fully registered we were there. The alarm went up quickly after that, shouts echoing across the open space, weapons fire lighting the darkness in sharp, controlled bursts. I felt the heat of a near miss pass close enough to singe the edge of my sleeve, and forced myself to keep moving rather than freeze, remembering the lesson Ixara herself had drilled into me during that first blade test in the sunken chamber below the palace. Do not flinch. Think clearly. Move with purpose. Near the base of the transport ramp, I found King Dravencor himself, standing with 2 personal guards flanking him, and Ixara held firmly between them, her hands bound, but her chin raised in defiance that told me clearly she had not given up the fight even for a moment. Let her go, I said, my weapon raised and steady despite the pounding of my own heart. Dravencor smiled that same cold, joyless smile from the banquet hall days earlier. You are remarkably persistent for hired muscle, he said. I had hoped the first attempt would discourage you. It seems I underestimated your stubbornness. You underestimated a lot of things, I said, mostly her. Ixara's eyes met mine across the short distance, sharp and fierce despite everything, and in that single look I understood exactly what she wanted me to do. Not hesitate, not negotiate, act. The guard on her left made the mistake of glancing toward Dravencor for instruction at exactly the wrong moment, and Ixara used the distraction to drive her bound hands hard into his throat, staggering him just enough to break free and throw herself clear of the line of fire. I moved the instant she did, closing the distance fast, trading blows with the remaining guard while Owen engaged Dravencor's personal escort near the ramp, the sound of weapons fire and clashing blades filling the loading dock with chaos. It was not an elegant fight. It was fast, desperate, and close, every exchange decided by half a second of hesitation on one side or the other. I took a glancing hit along my ribs that would leave a deep bruise for weeks afterward, but managed to disarm the guard in front of me and turned just in time to see Dravencor himself lunging toward Ixara with a blade drawn, his composed mask finally cracking into something far more desperate and dangerous. I threw myself between them without thinking, catching the blow meant for her across my forearm instead, pain lancing bright and sharp through the impact. Dravencor's eyes widened slightly, as though genuinely surprised that a hired soldier would place himself in harm's way for a woman he had known barely 2 weeks. Why? He demanded, echoing the very question I had asked the palace guard on my first day in that throne room. Why would you throw your life away for her? Because unlike you, I said through gritted teeth, forcing him back a step with a hard counterstrike. I actually see her as a person, not a prize to be won. The sound of Sellen's squad finally arriving echoed across the loading dock. Boots pounding against stone, weapons raised, cutting off any remaining escape route Draven Corps might have hoped for. Surrounded, outnumbered, and clearly recognizing the situation had slipped entirely beyond his control, he lowered his blade slowly, his expression twisting into something between fury and disbelief. "This is not finished," he said, his voice low and venomous, as guards moved to restrain him. "You have made an enemy far more dangerous than you realize, human." "I have made a few of those already," I said, breathing hard, my forearm throbbing where his blade had cut through fabric and skin alike. "I am starting to lose count." As the guards led him away in restraints, Ixara turned to me, her bound hands finally freed by one of Sellen's officers, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. The adrenaline was still hammering through my system, my ribs and forearm aching in matching rhythm, and yet somehow none of it seemed to matter as much as the simple fact that she was standing there, alive, unharmed, looking at me with an expression I had not seen from her before. "You are bleeding," she said quietly. "It happens," I said. "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. And then, after a pause that felt heavier than it should have, she added something that surprised me far more than the fight itself had. "Thank you for not hesitating." I did not have a clever answer for that either. For once, I simply let the silence stand and allowed myself to believe, for a brief and fragile moment, that the worst of the danger might finally be behind us. I was wrong. What we uncovered from Draven Corps' interrogation over the following 2 days would reveal that his ambition, dangerous as it was, had only ever been a single piece of something far larger and far older, a threat that had been quietly circling this palace long before I ever refused to kneel in that throne room. The interrogation of King Draven Corps began the following morning, conducted quietly within a secure chamber deep beneath the palace, far from the ears of visiting dignitaries or curious court gossip. I was not officially permitted inside, but Ixara insisted I stand near the door, and nobody in the room seemed willing to argue with her about it after everything that had happened the night before. Draven Corps sat in restraints, his usual composure entirely gone, replaced by something closer to genuine fear. Whatever confidence had carried him through the loading dock confrontation had clearly evaporated somewhere between his capture and this cold underground room. "Tell us who else was involved," Chancellor Mordain said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper than I had heard from him before. "You did not plan this alone. A minor trading house crest and a handful of hired blades do not explain remote explosives placed inside a vault sealed by ancient palace wards." Draven Corps' jaw tightened. He said nothing for a long moment, his eyes darting toward Ixara, toward me, toward Mordain, as though calculating which direction offered the least danger. "You do not understand what you are dealing with," he finally said, his voice low. "I did not act out of ambition alone. I was given no choice." "Explain," Ixara said, stepping forward, her expression unreadable, but her voice carrying an authority that filled the entire room. "Months ago," Draven Corps said, "a delegation arrived at my court, not from any world within our known alliances. They called themselves emissaries of the Vraxil. The name meant nothing to me, but the reaction in the room told me everything I needed to know." Mordain's face went pale in an instant, and Ixara's hands, which had remained steady through everything else, curled slowly into fists at her sides. "That is not possible," Mordain said quietly. "The Vraxil were driven from this sector 3 generations ago. Their fleets were destroyed. Their name was struck from every alliance record across a dozen systems. Apparently not thoroughly enough," Draven Corps said bitterly. "They found me. They showed me things I cannot unsee, weapons capable of leveling entire cities, technology beyond anything our combined worlds currently possess. They told me they required specific worlds within this sector to fall under new leadership willing to cooperate quietly with their return. Thren Vok was at the very top of that list. Why? I asked, unable to hold the question back despite not officially being part of this interrogation. What makes this world so important to them specifically? Draven Kor looked directly at Ixara when he answered, and something in his expression shifted from fear into something closer to reluctant pity. Because of her bloodline, he said, the Vraxil did not simply lose this sector 3 generations ago. They were driven out by an alliance led by her family's ancestors, an alliance her direct line has carried the memory and the authority of ever since. As long as a Velthane sits on this throne, every surviving world that fought against the Vraxil still recognizes a rallying point strong enough to resist them again if they ever tried to return. They cannot simply invade while that bloodline remains intact and respected across the sector. The room went utterly silent. I looked at Ixara, watching the color drain slowly from her face, as pieces she had clearly never been given before finally clicked into place. That is why my mother's closest advisors died so suddenly during her final years, she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. That is why 3 of my father's siblings never survived past their 30th year. I was always told these were misfortunes. Isolated tragedies. They were neither, Draven Kor said quietly. They were a slow, patient campaign to weaken and eventually eliminate your entire line, carried out carefully enough to never draw suspicion toward a single unified cause. And the 13 suitor kings, I said, the realization settling over me with a cold, heavy weight. That was never simply about marriage alliances or trade routes, was it? Draven Kor's silence was answer enough. Some of them came honestly, he finally admitted. Genuine political ambition, nothing more sinister than that. But at least 4 of the 13, myself included, were approached directly by Vraxil emissaries and given the same choice I was given. Secure her hand through marriage, gain influence over the throne from within, and quietly open this world to Vraxil return. Or refuse, and watch our own territories suffer consequences we could not begin to defend against. And when marriage failed, I said, understanding now exactly why he had turned to abduction rather than simply walking away after his humiliation. You still had to deliver results, or face those consequences yourself. Draven Kor did not answer, but the flicker of genuine fear across his face told me I had guessed correctly. Ixara turned away from him abruptly, walking a few steps toward the far wall of the chamber, her shoulders rigid with a tension I had not seen from her even during the loading dock confrontation. I followed, standing close but giving her the space to process what she had just learned about her entire life, being quietly reshaped by forces she had never even known existed. Every king who ever came to this world, she said quietly, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Every single one, I judged them for ambition, for cowardice, for cruelty. And some of them were simply trying to survive an impossible choice, forced on them by an enemy I did not even know still existed. That does not excuse what he did tonight, I said. Choice or not, he still chose to take you by force rather than warn you the truth. No, she agreed, it does not, but it changes what this actually is. This was never simply a princess refusing suitors out of pride or fear. This is a war that has been quietly circling this throne for years, and I have been fighting it half-blind the entire time. Before anyone could respond further, the chamber door burst open, and Selen appeared, breathless, her expression carrying an urgency that immediately silenced every other concern in the room. Princess, she said, sensor arrays along the outer system have detected a fleet emerging from deep space, moving directly toward Thren Vok. Unknown configuration, not matching any registered alliance or trade vessel in our database. How long until they reach orbit? Mordain asked sharply. Selen's expression tightened further. Given their current speed, she said, less than 6 hours. The color drained fully from Draven Kor's face this time, his restrained hands trembling visibly. They said they would come eventually, he said quietly, almost to himself. I did not think it would be this soon. I did not think my failure tonight would accelerate it this quickly. They were never going to wait for your success or failure indefinitely, Ixara said coldly, though I could hear the fear beneath her controlled tone. You were simply one thread among many. If you failed, they would move to eliminate the obstacle directly, rather than continue waiting on convenient politics. 6 hours, I said, my mind already shifting from shock into something closer to the cold, focused calculation I relied on during actual combat deployments. That is not enough time to properly evacuate a planetary population, and nowhere near enough time to summon meaningful reinforcement from allied worlds. No, Mordain agreed grimly. It is enough time, however, to prepare what defenses we do have, and to ensure the one thing the Vraxel fear most remains standing when their fleet arrives in orbit. What is that? I asked. Mordain's gaze shifted toward Ixara, steady and resolute despite the fear clearly running beneath his composed exterior. Her, he said simply. As long as she stands, as long as the Velthane line remains visibly defiant rather than broken or hidden away, every surviving world that remembers what her ancestors accomplished against the Vraxil still has a reason to rally rather than surrender. That is precisely why they have spent years trying to remove her quietly rather than simply attacking outright. An open invasion against a defiant, visible heir risks reigniting exactly the alliance that defeated them the first time. Then we make sure I remain visible, Ixara said, her voice steadying with each word, the fear I had seen moments earlier hardening slowly back into the composed resolve I had first encountered in that throne room days ago. We do not hide, we do not run. We stand on the walls of this palace, and we make certain every allied world within transmission range sees exactly what is happening here. That is a considerable risk, Princess, Mordain said carefully. It is the only option that gives us a chance at anything beyond quiet surrender, she said. I have spent my entire life being protected, tested, isolated for my own safety, all while an enemy I did not even know existed slowly dismantled everything around me. I am done being protected from a distance. If this war has finally arrived at my doorstep, then I intend to meet it standing, not hiding. I stepped forward without fully deciding to, the words leaving me before I had time to second-guess them. Then you will not be standing there alone, I said. She turned to look at me, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything else. Whatever this had started as, whatever careless refusal to kneel had set into motion weeks ago, it had clearly become something far larger than either of us had expected, and there was no version of the coming hours that did not require every ounce of courage we both had left. Selen, Mordain said, breaking the silence, already pivoting toward the practical urgency of what remained. Sound the general alert, recall every available guard and volunteer to defensive positions. We have 6 hours to prepare this palace to withstand an enemy this sector has not faced directly in 3 generations. As the chamber emptied into a flurry of urgent movement, alarms beginning to echo faintly through the corridors above us, I caught Ixara's arm gently before she moved to follow the others, needing to say one more thing before whatever came next swept us both away from any chance at quiet conversation. Whatever happens up there, I said, I am not leaving your side. Not because some ancient bloodline needs a symbol standing beside it. Because I choose to be there. Something in her expression softened, just briefly, before the resolve settled back over it, steady and unshaken. Then let us go make certain the Vraxil remember exactly why they feared this throne in the first place, she said. 6 hours had never felt shorter in my entire life, and somewhere far beyond the pale sky of Threnn Vok, an enemy that had waited 3 generations for its chance, was already closing the distance, unaware that the throne they intended to break had just found the one ally it needed most. The 6 hours passed faster than any 6 hours I had ever lived through, each minute swallowed by preparation, and by the time the sky above Threnn Vok began to darken with the shadow of an approaching fleet, the palace had transformed from a place of quiet politics into something closer to a fortress bracing for siege. Selen had the guard organized along the outer walls within the first hour, reinforcing weak points with whatever defensive emplacements the palace armory could provide. Owen worked alongside her, his combat experience proving invaluable as he helped position volunteers along the upper battlements, explaining angles of fire and fallback positions in a calm, steady voice that helped settle the nerves of soldiers who had never faced anything like what was coming. Grace, to my surprise, threw herself into coordinating communication between the palace and every allied trade contact she could reach, relaying urgent messages across the sector in the hope that Mordane's theory about rallying old alliances would prove correct before it was too late. I spent most of those hours beside Ixara, moving from position to position across the palace defenses, watching her speak with soldiers, engineers, and frightened palace staff alike, her voice steady even as the fear beneath it never fully disappeared. She did not hide from anyone during those hours. She made certain every person preparing to defend that palace saw her standing among them, not sequestered safely away in some hidden chamber below. King Dravenkor, released from restraint under close guard on the condition that he help however he could to atone for the danger his choices had brought, proved surprisingly useful in the final hour before the fleet arrived. His territory had faced skirmishes with rogue raiders in the past, and his knowledge of defensive formations against superior firepower gave Selen's forces a tactical advantage they would not have had otherwise. "I never expected to be fighting beside you rather than against you," I told him as we worked together, reinforcing a weakened section of the outer wall. "Neither did I," he admitted quietly. "I spent years telling myself the choices I made were necessary. Watching what those choices nearly cost tonight has made it very difficult to keep believing that. That is something," I said. "Not enough to erase what happened, but something. It will have to be enough for now," he said, hefting a length of reinforced plating into position. "There is little time left for anything else." He was right. Less than 20 minutes later, the first ships of the Vraxil fleet broke through the upper atmosphere, dark angular shapes cutting against the darkening sky, their approach eerily silent despite their size. I had fought in difficult places before, dangerous places, places where the odds were never close to fair. I had never seen anything quite like this, an enemy fleet that had waited 3 generations for exactly this moment, descending on a world that had spent those same 3 generations believing the threat long since ended. "Hold formation." Selen's voice rang out across the defensive positions, amplified through the palace communication system. "Do not break ranks. Wait for my signal." I stood beside Ixara, near the central command position on the upper battlement, watching the fleet descend closer, my weapon steady in my hands despite the tightness gripping my chest. Beside me, she stood tall, unflinching, exactly as she had during that very first blade test in the sunken chamber weeks earlier, refusing to give even the smallest outward sign of the fear I knew had to be there beneath the surface. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, without looking away from the approaching fleet, "I am glad it was you standing beside me when it finally arrived. I am glad it was you worth standing beside," I said. The first wave of Vraxil landing craft touched down along the palace perimeter with a force that shook the ground beneath us, disgorging armored soldiers unlike anything I had encountered before, their weapons humming with an energy signature that made my skin prickle even from a distance. Selen's voice rang out again, sharp and clear. "Now," she shouted, "defend the palace." What followed was chaos, controlled as much as chaos could ever be controlled. A desperate defense fought across walls and courtyards as Vraxil soldiers pressed forward against a defending force that, despite being vastly outmatched in raw technology, fought with a ferocity born from finally understanding exactly what they were fighting to protect. I moved through that chaos with Ixara close beside me, covering each other through exchange after exchange, every lesson from those strange, dangerous tests weeks earlier, suddenly proving to be exactly the preparation neither of us had realized we needed. At one point, a group of Vraxil soldiers broke through a weakened section of the eastern wall, pushing dangerously close to the inner courtyard where wounded defenders and frightened palace staff had gathered for safety. I did not hesitate. I threw myself into that breach alongside Owen and a handful of Selen's soldiers, holding the line through sheer stubborn refusal to let that position fall, until Draven Corps arrived with reinforcements from the western wall, sealing the breach just as the last of the initial wave began to withdraw. "We are holding," Owen said, breathing hard, blood trickling from a shallow cut along his temple. "Barely, but we are holding." "For now," I said. "This was only the first wave. Whatever commands that fleet, it has not committed everything yet." I was right. Less than an hour later, a single massive transport descended through the smoke and chaos, settling in the central courtyard with a deliberate, almost arrogant slowness that told me exactly what it represented. This was not another wave of soldiers. This was the commander himself, coming to finish what 3 generations of patience had built toward. He emerged flanked by an honor guard of elite Vraxel warriors, tall and imposing, his armor marked with symbols of rank I did not recognize but understood instinctively to mean authority. His voice, when it came, carried across the courtyard with an artificial clarity that told me it was being projected through some kind of translation device. "Princess Velthane," he said, his tone carrying the same cold arrogance I had heard from Draven Corps weeks earlier, though far more absolute, far more certain of its own inevitability. "3 generations. Your bloodline has stood as an obstacle to our return. Tonight, that obstacle ends." Ixara stepped forward, her posture unbowed despite the exhaustion and fear I knew had to be gripping her after everything the last several hours had demanded. "My ancestors ended your last attempt at conquest here," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "I intend to honor that legacy, not abandon it." "You stand nearly alone," the commander said, his gaze sweeping briefly across the battered defenders still holding position around the courtyard. "A handful of soldiers, a disgraced king seeking redemption he does not deserve, and a human mercenary who understands nothing of what is truly at stake here." "I understand plenty," I said, stepping up beside her without hesitation. "I understand that you have spent 3 generations planning to walk in here and take what you want because you assumed nobody left standing would actually fight back. I am telling you right now, that assumption was wrong." The commander's eyes settled on me with something between contempt and genuine curiosity, as though trying to understand why a creature from a world his people had likely never even bothered cataloging would dare speak to him at all. "You are the one causing so much disruption among the suitor kings," he said, "the one who refused to kneel." "Word travels fast," I said. "We monitored every development within this court closely," he said. "Your interference has cost us considerable time and resources we did not intend to spend. That debt will be settled tonight, alongside everything else." Before he could say more, a sound began building across the courtyard, distant at first, then growing steadily louder, the unmistakable hum of approaching engines cutting through the smoke-filled sky. I looked up, along with everyone else on that battlefield, and watched as a formation of ships began breaking through the atmosphere from multiple directions at once, bearing colors and markings from at least 4 different allied worlds I recognized from the star charts Ixara had shown me during quieter evenings in the palace archives. Grace's voice crackled through a nearby communication relay, breathless with relief and disbelief in equal measure. "Ethan," she said, "they came. Every world that fought against the Vraxel 3 generations ago, they saw the transmissions, they saw her standing defiant on those walls, and they came." The Vraxel commander's composed expression finally cracked, just slightly, as he watched Allied reinforcement ships descend rapidly toward the palace grounds, weapons already engaging his remaining fleet in the skies above. Mordane's earlier theory had proven correct after all. As long as the Velthane line stood visible and defiant rather than hidden or broken, the old alliance that had defeated the Vraxel once before still remembered exactly what that defiance meant and had answered the call without hesitation. "This is not over," the commander said, his voice tight with barely restrained fury as he began retreating toward his transport, his honor guard closing protectively around him. "It is for tonight," Ixara said, stepping forward with a fierce, unshaken authority that finally, truly matched every fearsome story I had heard whispered about her since the moment I first arrived on this world. Leave this system, or find out exactly how much of that old alliance still remembers how to finish what it started 3 generations ago. The commander held her gaze a long moment, clearly calculating the odds now stacked heavily against him, before finally retreating fully into his transport without another word. Within minutes, the remaining Vraxel forces began a hasty, disorganized withdrawal, pursued by Allied ships determined to make certain the retreat became a rout rather than a strategic pause. The battle for Thren Vok was over, though the sun was only just beginning to rise over a courtyard littered with the evidence of everything that had happened during the long night behind us. In the days that followed, the palace slowly returned to something resembling order, though nothing about it felt quite the same as before. Allied delegations arrived from across the sector, eager to formalize new agreements now that the old threat everyone believed long since ended had proven itself very much alive and finally been pushed back once again. Draven Kor, stripped of much of his previous influence but spared harsher punishment in recognition of his eventual choice to fight rather than flee, returned to his territory with a considerably more humble outlook than the one he had arrived with weeks earlier. Chancellor Mordain began the long, careful work of rebuilding alliances and defenses that would ensure this sector never again found itself caught so unprepared should the Vraxel attempt another return. Grace approached me on the morning our original trade envoy mission was finally set to conclude, her expression carrying equal parts relief and reluctant amusement. "You do realize," she said, "that you came here as hired security for a trade signing, and somehow ended up at the center of an interstellar war that reshaped alliances across half the sector." "When you put it that way, it does sound a little dramatic," I admitted. "A little," she said, laughing despite herself. "The Envoy Council back home is going to have quite a report to read through." I found Ixara later that same day, standing on the same battlement where we had waited together for the Vraxel fleet to arrive, though the smoke and chaos of that night had long since cleared into a calm, quiet morning. She turned as I approached, and for the first time since I had met her, the guarded, careful distance she kept from nearly everyone was simply absent from her expression entirely. "The Council has been discussing your future here," she said. "Given everything you have done for this world, they are prepared to offer you a formal position within the Royal Guard, should you wish to remain." "Is that what you want?" I asked. "Or is that simply what the Council wants?" She considered the question carefully before answering, exactly the way she considered everything, weighing it fully rather than offering an easy answer simply because it was expected. "I have spent my entire life being told what a suitor should look like," she said. "A king, a political alliance, someone chosen for the sake of power rather than genuine trust. I am done accepting answers simply because they are expected of me." "Then what do you actually want?" I asked. She stepped closer, the distance between us finally closing in a way that had nothing to do with tests or trials or careful calculation. "I want someone who chooses to stand beside me because he wants to, not because a crown demands it," she said. "I already know exactly who that is." "I do not do well with crowns anyway," I said. "Where I come from, we prefer partnerships, equal footing." The occasional argument over something completely unimportant, followed by an apology neither of us fully means. "That sounds considerably more honest than anything this court has offered me in years," she said, something close to real, unguarded warmth finally breaking through in her voice. Word of what happened on Thren Vok spread quickly across the sector in the weeks that followed, growing, as these things always do, into something larger and more dramatic with each retelling. By the time the story reached the furthest edges of Allied space, it had become legend, whispered in trade stations and military briefings alike. The Unbroken Flame, the princess who had turned away 13 kings and stood defiant against an ancient enemy returning after 3 generations of silence, had finally found the one person capable of standing beside her rather than trying to stand above her. They rarely got the details exactly right. Most versions left out the burnt copper wine entirely, which felt, to me at least, like leaving out the single most important detail of the entire story. But the ending, however dramatically embellished across 100 retellings, always landed on the same simple truth. She was never broken. She was never conquered. She was, finally and simply, met by someone too stubborn to understand he was supposed to be afraid in the first place. And if you ask me, standing beside her on that same battlement years later, watching two moons rise together over a horizon finally at peace, I would not trade a single terrifying, reckless moment of how it all began.